They say the loudest men die first. The ones who shout, who brag, who want the world to know their name, the streets swallow them whole. But the quiet ones? They live forever. This is the story of three ghosts who ruled America from the shadows. Big Jim Colosimo, the man who mistook applause for power. Vincent the Chin Gigante, who pretended to be insane just to stay invisible. And Liborio Barney Bellomo, the successor who turned silence into an empire. From Chicago's golden vice halls to New York's rain-soaked alleys, their whispers built kingdoms, outlived bullets, and rewrote the rules of control. Tonight, let the noise of the world fade. Close your eyes. Listen to the city breathe. Because in the end, power doesn't shout. It whispers. Chicago, 1910. The city gleamed like a jewel stolen from the mud. Smoke curled above its skyline, the kind that carried the scent of ambition and ash. Every man who walked its streets believed he could make himself here, if he had the stomach to survive the climb. But for one man the climb was over. He had reached the top, and tonight he intended to enjoy the view. Inside Colosimo's cafe, chandeliers spilled golden light across velvet booths and mirrored walls. Waiters in crisp vests wove through the crowd, their trays stacked with champagne flutes that clinked like coins falling into a well. A jazz band played in the corner, soft enough to let the laughter of politicians and police captains fill the gaps between notes. The smell of cigars, perfume, and roasted steak hung heavy in the air. It was not just a restaurant, it was a throne room. At the center of it all stood Big Jim Colosimo. Thick, proud, polished like the marble floors beneath his feet. The diamond in his tie flashed each time he lifted his glass. He was the kind of man who didn't need to speak loudly. His presence did the talking. Chicago bowed to him even when it pretended not to. The judges dined at his tables, the detectives owed him favors, and every deal worth making passed through this room before reaching City Hall. But power in Chicago was like the weather, always changing, always waiting to turn. Big Jim toasted to his guests, his booming laugh shaking the smoke above their heads. To the city that never sleeps, he said, and to the men who make sure she never runs dry. The crowd erupted in applause. Across the room, aldermen raised their glasses. The chief of police smiled like a man pretending to be off duty. To anyone looking in from the rain outside, the cafe glowed like a cathedral of sin. Behind that shine, though, shadows were moving. From a booth near the back, Johnny Torrio watched his boss with a look that mixed admiration and calculation. Torrio was everything Colosimo wasn't. Slim, silent, deliberate. He'd come from Brooklyn to expand the business, to turn vice into enterprise. He saw the future coming like a freight train. Prohibition. A dry America meant only one thing: the men who could quench its thirst would own it. But Big Jim didn't see it that way. "You talk too much about the future," Colosimo had told him earlier that week. "I've already got everything a man could want. A business, respect, a woman who makes me forget I'm 50 years old." He'd said it with that same slow confidence that made even crooked cops laugh at his jokes. But Torrio didn't laugh. He just nodded, eyes cold and thoughtful. Now, across the room, Victoria, the woman in question, brushed past the waiters and made her way to Jim. She was draped in green silk, her perfume cutting through the smoke like a promise. Her voice was soft, the kind that could make a man forget the weight of his empire. "Jimmy," she whispered, placing a hand on his sleeve, "you've built something untouchable. But don't let it make you blind. You can't trust everyone who smiles at you." Colosimo grinned, eyes half closed. "Sweetheart, if I worried about every smile in this city, I'd never eat my dinner." But her warning lingered in the air like the last note of a dying song. The night thickened. Rain began to fall outside, streaking down the windows, turning the city lights into liquid gold. Inside, the laughter grew louder, the band faster. But beneath the noise, a faint unease crept through the room. Two men had entered quietly through the side door, men who didn't belong. They wore long coats despite the warmth, their eyes scanning the crowd with mechanical calm. Torrio saw them first. He didn't move, didn't speak. Just looked down at his pocket watch. The second hand ticked past midnight. Big Jim stood in the center of the floor, telling a story to a group of businessmen about how he once threw a man through a window for refusing to pay. They laughed. He laughed louder. He didn't notice the shadow at his back. One of the men from the door stepped closer. The band shifted into a slow blues. The clinking of silverware faded. And then, a single shot. Soft, distant, almost gentle, like a champagne cork popping in another room. For a heartbeat, the music didn't stop. The laughter didn't falter. Then Colosimo stumbled. His glass slipped from his hand, shattering against the marble. He looked down, confused, as a dark bloom spread across his white shirt. The diamond on his tie winked one last time before he fell face-first into the tablecloth. The room erupted. A woman screamed. Someone shouted for help. The clarinet squealed off-key. But by the time anyone reached him, the two men were gone, swallowed by the storm outside. Torrio rose from his seat, adjusted his hat, and walked out through the front door. Rain splashed across his shoes. He didn't look back at the chaos behind him. In his mind, the city had just been reborn. Big Jim's era was over. The throne was empty, and soon it would belong to him. Back inside, Victoria knelt beside the body, her hands trembling as she touched his cheek. "You fool," she whispered through her tears. "You trusted too many ghosts." Her voice cracked like glass. Around her, the guests began to scatter, pretending not to know what they had seen. The police would come, take statements, write reports filled with convenient blanks. But the truth would never make it to paper. In Chicago it never did. The rain outside grew heavier, washing the city clean of evidence. By morning, the newspapers would call it a tragic assassination, a gang dispute, a love triangle gone wrong. They'd print his picture, the smile, the tuxedo, the diamond, and tell readers that Chicago had lost its most colorful businessman. But the truth was simpler. Big Jim Colosimo had built an empire on loyalty and luxury, and he died believing both would save him. 4 weeks after his death, the cafe stayed closed. But neighbors swore they still saw him standing in the window at night, his reflection flickering behind the rain-streaked glass. Some said if you passed the alley after midnight, you could hear the faint sound of jazz playing, though the instruments had long been packed away. The city moved on, of course. It always did. Within a month, Torrio reopened the cafe. He changed the name, the menu, the staff. But he kept the same corner table where Big Jim once sat, untouched. Superstition, maybe? Or a reminder of what happens when a man mistakes comfort for power. And in the shadows, another figure began to rise, young, brash, hungry. Alphonse Capone. Torrio brought him in quietly, the way a man hides a loaded weapon until he's ready to use it. Together they would build something far greater, and far bloodier, than Big Jim ever imagined. But that's another story. For now, the city sleeps under a blanket of rain and regret. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolls over Lake Michigan. And in the flicker of lightning, if you look close enough, you might still see Big Jim's ghost raising his glass to the skyline, whispering to no one and everyone. In this city, kid, every feast ends with a storm. Before the diamond tie, before the champagne and the laughter of crooked politicians, there was only mud. Chicago in the 1890s was a city half built and half broken, a sprawl of rail tracks, slaughterhouses and smoke. The stench of blood and iron hung heavy near the stockyards, where cattle screams mixed with the hiss of steam engines. Men worked until their hands cracked and then they drank until they forgot. Among them was a boy from Calabria, Giacomo Colosimo, known to no one but himself. He was small then, thin and mean-eyed, with dirt under his nails and a hunger that could burn through bone. He'd come to America chasing the same promise everyone else had, that here, a man could own his own life. But what he found instead was a city that devoured the weak and rewarded only those ruthless enough to keep standing. He learned fast. He started as a shoeshine boy near Halsted Street, kneeling before the boots of men who never looked down. He polished, smiled, nodded, and listened. Always listened. Every man had a secret, and Giacomo learned that secrets were currency. Which police took bribes. Which politicians cheated on their wives. Which businesses were struggling to pay debts they didn't want their creditors to know about. By 17 he wasn't shining shoes anymore. He was collecting money, first for local gamblers, then for pimps and madams who needed protection. He carried a blackjack in his coat pocket and a rosary around his neck, an odd combination that made people nervous. But he never liked blood. He liked order. And when you owed Giacomo, you paid him. Always. They started calling him Big Jim before he was even big. The name stuck, growing with him as his wallet thickened and his confidence hardened. He began dressing better, pressed suits, polished shoes, silk ties even on bad days. He spoke English with a rough, heavy rhythm that people remembered. His words were slow, deliberate, like he was always testing the weight of what he said. The city was changing and Big Jim changed with it. The vice trade, gambling, prostitution, protection, had been chaos for years. Fights broke out over territory every week. Cops took bribes but never enough to keep the peace. Big Jim saw opportunity in the noise. He started uniting the small operators not by force but by persuasion and presence. He'd walk into a rival's saloon, order a drink and talk as if he already owned the place. By the time he left, he usually did. Within a decade, he ran nearly every brothel on Chicago's South Side. They called his operation the Levee, a walled city of sin protected by the police, fed by the desperation of the poor. He didn't run from morality, he bought it wholesale. Judges dined at his restaurants. Detectives dropped by for free meals and envelopes of cash. When reporters tried to dig into his affairs, they found themselves reassigned, or simply vanished into the fog of unsolved disappearances. But for all his power, Big Jim still went home each night to a modest apartment, where he counted his cash by hand and thought about how easily it could all fall apart. It was during this climb that he met Torrio, a sharp young man from Brooklyn recommended by mutual friends in New York. Torrio wasn't like the street thugs of Chicago. He was quiet, methodical, and more importantly, educated in the ways of the New York underworld. He talked about structure, about building a business that could last longer than its owner. "You run girls and gambling," Torrio said one night over whiskey. "But vice dies when the cops change or the laws shift. You need something bigger, something nobody can outlaw." Big Jim had laughed. "And what's that?" Torrio smiled. "Thirst." Colosimo had shrugged it off. The man was a dreamer, he thought. But he kept him close anyway. Torrio was too clever to be left in the hands of competitors. Chicago by 1905 belonged to Big Jim. He'd bought a house that looked more like a palace. Columns, fountains, imported marble. The newspapers called him a gentleman entrepreneur, and though they knew better, they couldn't resist his charm. He began throwing dinner parties, inviting aldermen, cops, even priests. The music flowed, the women sparkled, and Big Jim laughed loudest of them all. But success came with ghosts. Rivals whispered that he'd gone soft, that he'd traded his fists for silverware, his instincts for indulgence. The younger men were hungrier, bolder, less patient. Torrio warned him of it often. "Respect fades faster than money, boss," he said once. "Keep your edge." Big Jim waved him off. "I built this city," he said, eyes gleaming. "Nobody forgets the man who built their home." He was wrong, of course. Chicago forgot everything except survival. The first cracks appeared not in his empire but in his heart. He met Victoria Moresco, a singer half his age with dark eyes and a voice that could turn smoke into velvet. She wasn't impressed by his reputation. Maybe that's why he fell for her. He built her a stage, gave her his name, and called her his queen. But love in his world was always expensive. His wife, Louise, had stood by him since the mud streets of Calabria. She'd endured his temper, his affairs, his ambition. But when Victoria came, she knew it was different. Louise filed for divorce, and in doing so, opened the door for every man who had ever waited for Big Jim to make a mistake. The papers had a field day. The scandal humiliated him. And in humiliation he began to lose something crucial: fear. The kind of fear that keeps dangerous men alive. By 1909, Torrio was running most of the day-to-day business. Big Jim preferred hosting dinners, shaking hands, playing the respectable businessman. But Torrio's eyes were already fixed on something else. Prohibition was coming fast, and with it, a new kind of empire. He tried to convince Big Jim again. "Liquor, boss. That's the future. The people will pay anything for it. The city will drown in money." But Colosimo shook his head. "I don't want to fight the feds. I've fought enough wars." That was the moment Torrio realized something dangerous. Big Jim didn't want to build anymore. He wanted to rest. And in Chicago, rest was another word for weakness. There's a saying in the underworld: no man stays king forever. Even Big Jim knew it deep down. Some nights, when the rain hit the windows just right, he'd think of the old days, of the boy polishing shoes in the gutter, of the streets that tried to kill him and failed. He'd ask himself if all this, the marble, the women, the laughter, was worth what he'd become. Then he'd pour another drink, adjust his diamond tie, and tell himself it was. But outside, the storm was already forming. Torrio had begun whispering to men who didn't fear Big Jim anymore. Men who believed Chicago needed a new king. Men like Al Capone, who just arrived from New York with the kind of hunger you could smell. And somewhere between the sound of jazz and the hum of politics, Big Jim's empire began to rot from the inside out. He couldn't see it yet. But everyone else could. One evening he walked alone through the alley behind his cafe. The rain had just stopped, leaving puddles that shimmered like oil. He could hear the city breathing, the distant horns, the rattle of streetcars, the laughter from bars that paid him tribute. He paused, staring up at the dark windows of his restaurant. Once they had symbolized triumph. Now they looked like watchful eyes. He lit a cigar, the flame flickering in the wind, and whispered to himself, "Let them come. I built this place with blood. They'll drown in it before they take it. He believed it. Every word. And that belief was what killed him. Because the men who were coming weren't drowning, they were learning how to swim in the very blood he spilled. When morning broke over Chicago, the rain had washed the streets clean. The newspapers ran another flattering article about Big Jim's philanthropy. They called him a man of culture, a patron of progress. And somewhere in Brooklyn, Johnny Torrio folded the paper, smiled faintly, and whispered to the boy sitting beside him, "Pack your things, kid. We're going west." The boy, Capone, grinned. "Chicago, huh?" Torrio nodded. "Yeah. There's a kingdom waiting for a new king." And so began the fall disguised as triumph, the empire born from dirt now trembling under the weight of its own gold. Big Jim Colosimo had risen higher than any immigrant dared to dream, but every empire casts a shadow, and his was long, hungry, and full of men who wanted his throne. The feast was over. The storm was coming. The rain returned to Chicago like an old debt. It came soft at first, thin silver lines tracing the rooftops, sliding down the neon signs, pooling at the corners of Colosimo's cafe. Inside, the chandeliers still glowed with warmth, but outside, the city was cold and watching. Big Jim stood at the window, cigar glowing faintly between his fingers, the reflection of his empire shimmering on the glass. Behind him, the faint hum of the band drifted from the dining room, a slow, sultry tune that made everything feel a little too calm. He'd asked for that. No crowds tonight, no banquets, no city officials pretending to be friends. Just quiet. Just him and the woman he couldn't stop thinking about. Victoria Moresco. She sat by the piano, her hair falling in soft curls, the green silk of her dress shimmering in the low light. The first time he saw her sing, he'd thought she was a dream, something too soft, too human for the world he'd built out of smoke and sin. But dreams, he had learned, were dangerous things. They made a man forget who he was. "You look tired," she said softly, her voice like a melody. He smiled without turning. "Running an empire will do that to you." She rose, walked to him, and rested her hand against his shoulder. "Maybe you don't have to run it anymore," she whispered. "Johnny can handle it now. You could go away with me. Leave all this." Big Jim turned, searching her eyes for something real. "You sound like you don't know this city, sweetheart. Chicago doesn't let go. You stop moving, you stop breathing." Victoria's hand lingered, but her gaze faltered. He didn't notice. He never noticed the silences until it was too late. That afternoon, Torrio had stopped by his office. He was polite, efficient, and distant, the way a man behaves when he's already made peace with something terrible. "They want to meet, boss," Torrio said, his tone unreadable. "A few of the boys. They think you're drifting." "Drifting?" Big Jim frowned. "You mean thinking. There's a difference." "I know," Torrio replied. "But they don't. You should come by tonight. Set things straight." Colosimo had nodded. He didn't like the idea, but Torrio was family. The man had saved him more than once, brought order when chaos threatened. He trusted him. Trusted him enough not to ask who they were. Now, standing by the window, Big Jim watched the rain and thought about the early days. About the boy from Calabria who swore he'd never kneel again. He'd fought, bribed, loved, and bled for this city. And now people called him soft. Maybe they were right. Maybe he'd forgotten how sharp power could be when you didn't handle it carefully. The band finished their tune. The pianist closed the lid and left. The cafe grew quiet, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant rumble of thunder. Victoria turned to him. "You sure you want to meet them here?" He nodded. "This place built me. Let it stand witness." When Torrio arrived, he was not alone. Two men followed him in, strangers, their coats still glistening from the rain. They looked like hired help, the kind that didn't talk much and didn't plan to stay long. "Torrio," Big Jim said, arms spread, smiling wide. "Didn't expect company." "Business," Torrio answered simply. His voice was calm, steady, too steady. "Just some boys from Brooklyn. Don't mind them." Big Jim's eyes narrowed slightly, but he forced the grin to stay. "Well, you tell your friends to have a drink. No business until we toast." The men didn't move. Neither did Torrio. The silence in the room thickened. The rain hit harder. "You know," Torrio said at last, walking closer, "I always admired you, Jim. You taught me how this city breathes. How to make it dance to your tune." He smiled faintly. "But maybe the music's changed." Big Jim exhaled a thin plume of smoke. "You sound like you've been talking to ghosts." "Maybe I have," Torrio said. "Or maybe I'm just listening to the living." Victoria stepped forward, her face pale. "Johnny, please." But Torrio didn't look at her. He looked at Jim, his eyes like slate. You built this city on order, he said. Now it needs chaos to grow. And you're not the man for that. Big Jim laughed, a deep, booming sound that filled the room. You think you can run this city without me? You think Chicago bows to kids with guns? Torrio didn't answer. He didn't need to. One of the men behind him stepped forward, hand inside his coat. Big Jim's smile faltered. The air changed. Everything went still, the kind of stillness that happens a second before a gunshot or a confession. He looked at Torrio and for the first time saw it. The distance. The decision. The inevitability. Johnny, he said quietly, his voice soft with disbelief, don't. Torrio's jaw tightened. It's already done. The gun flashed once, the sound swallowed by thunder. Big Jim staggered backward, one hand pressed against his chest. The cigar fell from his fingers, rolling across the floor. He tried to speak, but no words came, only a sharp gasp, the kind that belongs to men who realize too late that they've run out of time. He fell against the piano, his reflection breaking across the polished surface, and then to the floor. Victoria screamed, dropping to her knees beside him. Blood pooled beneath his tuxedo, spreading toward the mirrored wall. Torrio turned away. Come on, he said to the gunman. We're done here. For a moment only the rain answered. It hammered against the glass, drumming like applause for a play that had just ended. Victoria cradled Big Jim's head, whispering his name over and over. His eyes, already dim, tried to focus on her face. Why? He managed to choke out. Because you loved this city more than it ever loved you, she whispered back, tears mixing with the rain. He smiled faintly. Then nothing. Outside, Torrio stepped into the street. The rain was falling harder now, washing blood from his shoes, smearing the last traces of what he'd done into the gutters. He didn't look back. Beside him, one of the men lit a cigarette. You sure about this, Johnny? He asked. Torrio nodded. Chicago doesn't need a king. It needs a machine. Who runs the machine? The man asked. Torrio smiled thinly. We'll see. The next morning, the papers called it a gangland assassination. No suspects. No witnesses. No leads. The police issued statements, the mayor sent condolences, and the city pretended to mourn. But in every backroom, every saloon, every precinct office, people were already whispering the same name, Johnny Torrio. And somewhere in a small boarding house on the south side, a young man named Al Capone read the headline and grinned. Big Jim's out, he said to the mirror. Guess it's my turn. He slicked back his hair, straightened his collar, and walked out into the rain. That night, Colosimo's cafe stayed dark. But some swore they saw lights flicker inside. And if you passed close enough, they said you could hear a faint sound. The echo of a piano key struck once, softly, as if someone somewhere still refused to let the music end. The morning after Big Jim's death, Chicago woke up as if nothing had happened. The train still screamed through the stockyards, the smell of blood still hung over Halsted Street, and the fog still rolled in from the lake, thick and gray as gunpowder. But something invisible had shifted, like the city itself had taken a breath, realized its king was gone, and decided to keep breathing anyway. At Colosimo's cafe the doors stayed locked. Rainwater streaked the windows, carrying dust and ash into the gutters. A wilted rose lay forgotten by the entrance. Inside, the floor still bore a faint stain, half scrubbed away by men Torrio had sent before dawn. They worked in silence, throwing sawdust on the spot where the boss had fallen, whispering prayers they didn't believe. By noon the newspapers had arrived. Southside king slain in cold blood. Vice lord assassinated in his own cafe. The headlines made it sound like a story, not a life. There were no tears in the ink, no tremor in the typesetting. Just clean, indifferent letters pressed against cheap paper. The city read, nodded, and moved on. That was the thing about Chicago, it never stopped for anyone. But the people closest to Big Jim couldn't move on so easily. Victoria sat in her apartment, blinds drawn, staring at the necklace he'd given her the week before, a strand of pearls that no longer felt beautiful. The police had come, asked questions she couldn't answer, then left when Torrio arrived with a lawyer and a quiet envelope. She wasn't a suspect. She wasn't anything now. Just another woman who'd loved a man the city had already buried. She poured herself a drink, her hands trembling. You stupid bastard, she whispered into the glass. You thought they'd let you live forever. Torrio, meanwhile, handled everything with clinical precision. He met with the aldermen, the cops, the suppliers. He paid the right men, silenced the wrong ones, and made sure every whisper of accusation led nowhere. By the time the week ended, the official story was settled. Big Jim Colosimo had been killed by enemies unknown, possibly rivals from St. Louis. It was clean. It was convenient. It was exactly how Torrio wanted it. But even Torrio, for all his calm efficiency, couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He'd walk into the cafe at night, lights low, the air thick with dust and old perfume. He'd pour a drink, sit at Big Jim's table and listen to the silence. Sometimes he thought he heard a sound, a faint clink like a glass being lifted in a toast. Sometimes he saw the shadow of a man reflected in the mirror, standing where the blood had dried. He'd tell himself it was just the wind, the flicker of memory. But the feeling stayed. Al Capone arrived 2 weeks later, fresh from New York. He was younger than Torrio expected, barely 21, but with eyes that belonged to a man twice his age. Sharp, restless, dangerous. "You the new boss?" Capone asked, grinning as he sat across from Torrio at a quiet bar on 22nd Street. Torrio studied him. "There's no boss. There's business. You want in?" Capone's grin widened. "If there's money, I'm already in." The two men drank in silence for a while. Outside, thunder rolled over the lake, a low growl that seemed to rattle the windows. "You ever meet him?" Torrio asked. "Colosimo?" Capone shook his head. "No. But I heard he was the kind of guy who liked to be seen." Torrio nodded slowly. That was his mistake. Meanwhile, rumors about Big Jim's ghost spread like smoke through the Levee district. Bartenders swore they heard footsteps in empty hallways. Taxi drivers claimed to see a figure standing by the cafe at midnight, dressed in a white suit, rain running down his face but never soaking through. Some said it was nonsense, a story made up by drunks. Others swore it was real. They said if you passed too close to the old cafe at night, you could hear a man whispering in Italian, his voice low and full of warning. Chicago doesn't forget. She just pretends. Even Torrio, pragmatic as he was, avoided walking past the place after dark. But business didn't wait for ghosts. With Big Jim gone, Torrio consolidated the rackets. The brothels, the gambling dens, the protection rings, all absorbed into a single disciplined structure. The police were paid on time, the judges got their envelopes, and the money began to flow smoother than ever. Capone rose quickly, earning Torrio's trust with the same mix of charm and brutality that would one day make him famous. He handled the rough work, the muscle, the intimidation, the street deals. Torrio handled the books, the bribes, the strategy. Together they were unstoppable. Yet even as the empire expanded, Torrio couldn't escape the shadow of the man who'd built it. Big Jim's portrait still hung in his office. The diamond tie pin rested in a drawer. And sometimes when Torrio lit a cigar, he'd catch himself whispering, "Salute, boss," before realizing no one was there to answer. One night, months after the murder, Torrio found himself alone at the cafe. He'd reopened it under a new name, the Lexington Club, but the bones of the place hadn't changed. The same bar. The same chandelier. Even the same piano, though no one played it anymore. The city outside was quiet, muffled by snow. Inside, the only sound was the ticking of the clock. Torrio poured a drink and sat at the old corner table, the one Big Jim had always claimed. He stared at the empty chair across from him and said quietly, "You were right about one thing. The city never lets go." The glass in his hand trembled slightly as if the air had shifted. He looked up. The chandelier swayed faintly, though no wind touched it. He froze. From the piano came a single note, soft, deliberate. He stood, heart pounding, scanning the shadows. The room was empty. The note lingered in the air, long enough to make him doubt everything he'd just heard. Then it stopped. Torrio exhaled, shaking his head. "You're losing it, Johnny," he muttered. "It's just the building settling." But as he turned to leave, he could have sworn he heard a voice behind him, distant and low. "No one settles in Chicago." He spun around. Nothing. Only the flicker of light across the bar mirrors. He left the glass half full. Outside, the wind howled down the empty street. The sign above the door creaked, its paint already peeling. And for just a second, only long enough to make the skin crawl on the back of your neck, the reflection in the window wasn't Torrio's. It was Big Jim's. The same white tuxedo. The same grin. The same glint of the diamond tie. Watching. Waiting. By spring, the city had stopped talking about Colosimo. There were new names now, Torrio, Capone, O'Banion. The old codes of honor gave way to new rules. Guns first, questions later. The vice lords of Chicago's golden age were gone, replaced by something colder, faster, hungrier. But sometimes late at night, when a deal went wrong or a man disappeared without explanation, someone would lower their voice and say, It's the old man settling accounts. Because in Chicago, ghosts don't die. They just change hands. New York, 1951. The city breathed differently than Chicago. It didn't roar, it whispered. The wind through the alleys of Little Italy carried the smell of roasted chestnuts, cheap wine, and old promises. The streets were narrow, the buildings pressed together like gossiping neighbors, and somewhere beneath the noise of the city, an older rhythm pulsed, the rhythm of survival. In a small boxing gym off Mulberry Street, a young man was taking punches and giving them back harder. Sweat rolled down his jaw, mixing with the blood from his nose. His fists moved fast, angry, deliberate. Every hit sounded like a declaration. They called him Vincent Gigante. But his friends, what few he had, called him Chin. "Keep your hands up, kid," barked the trainer. "You fight like you got something to prove." Vincent spat blood onto the canvas and muttered, "I do." He wasn't lying. He'd grown up in the shadow of tenements where every sound echoed, the clatter of dishes, the crying of babies, the shouting in Italian between mothers and sons. His father worked odd jobs, his mother took in sewing, and Vincent, like most boys on the block, learned early that the world didn't care unless you made it. He wasn't the smartest, but he was quiet, observant, dangerous in a way that didn't need explaining. He fought because it was the only time he felt in control. In the ring, pain made sense. There were rules even if they were brutal. Outside the ring there were no rules, only favors, debts, and men in suits who decided what your life was worth. One of those men had started showing up to his fights lately, Vito Genovese. The name alone carried weight. People didn't speak it too loud, not even in Little Italy. After one match, when Vincent had won by knockout in the third round, Vito called him over. He was sitting ringside, clean suit, slick hair, a cigar resting in his hand like a scepter. His eyes were sharp, the kind that made you feel seen all the way through. "You fight like you mean it," Genovese said, voice smooth as oil. Vincent wiped his mouth. "I fight, 'cause it pays the rent." Vito smiled faintly. "There are better ways to pay the rent. You interested in making real money?" Vincent hesitated. "Doing what?" "Running errands," Vito said. "Delivering messages. Keeping your eyes open, your mouth shut." He leaned closer. "It's not the punches that make a man in this world, kid. It's knowing when not to throw one." That was how it began, not with a bang but with an invitation. Vincent stopped boxing soon after. Too many bruises, too little money. He started driving cars, carrying envelopes, collecting from local businesses. Nothing fancy. Nothing illegal, at least not on paper. But every job brought him deeper into the shadow of the Genovese family. He learned fast. Learned when to smile, when to vanish, when to keep quiet while other men talked too loud. He wasn't like the street guys who bragged about what they'd done. He stayed small, invisible, a ghost in plain sight. But beneath the calm, something was growing, a stillness that could turn violent without warning. One night, after a late run downtown, he stopped by a diner on Canal Street. The place was almost empty. A waitress poured him coffee and didn't ask questions. "You like that?" Across the counter, an old man was reading the Daily News. The headline, "Chicago Mob Reorganizes After Torrio's Exit." Vincent smirked. "Chicago?" he muttered. "Always loud." The old man looked up. "You talk like you been there." Vincent shook his head. "Nah, but I know their kind. Men who think noise makes them untouchable." He stirred his coffee, staring at the reflection in the black liquid. "It's the quiet ones who live the longest." By the late 1950s, that quiet had made him valuable. Vito trusted him with more than errands. He sent him to collect debts no one else could collect, to deliver warnings no one else could survive delivering. One winter evening, Vincent stood outside a warehouse on the docks, his breath fogging the air. Inside, 3 men were arguing, loud, angry, desperate. They owed Genovese money and they thought hiding would fix it. Vincent didn't knock. He opened the door, stepped inside, and waited until they noticed him. The talking stopped. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't threaten. He simply looked at them, calm and steady like a man looking at his own reflection. "You had time," he said softly. "You chose not to use it." No shouting followed. No chaos. Just the sound of the harbor wind and then, silence. When he walked back to the car, the driver asked, "It's done?" Vincent nodded. Yeah. They understood. Over the years the legend grew. The boxer who became the enforcer. The quiet one who spoke less but got more done. People began to fear him without knowing exactly why. He didn't gamble. He didn't drink. He didn't even smile much. He just listened, always listening, and when he did speak, men stopped talking. And through it all, Vito watched, proud. "You got something special, kid?" he said once. "You don't crave attention. That's rare." Vincent shrugged. "Attention gets you killed." Vito nodded. "You're learning." But every man who rises in this world eventually learns that loyalty is a coin, valuable but easily spent. When Vito fled to Italy to escape murder charges, Vincent was left adrift. The city changed hands, the old bosses fell, new ones rose. Vincent kept his head down, working quietly for whoever held the strings, waiting for the next wind to blow. He never forgot the lesson: the quiet ones live longest. Years passed. By the early 1970s, Vincent was no longer a street enforcer. He was a power broker, a man whose silence could move mountains. But the world had changed. The FBI was listening, the streets were wired, and the old ways were dying. That's when he made his most brilliant move, the act that would define him for decades. He started pretending to be insane. He wandered the streets in a bathrobe, muttering to himself. He mumbled prayers, talked to pigeons, crossed himself at traffic lights. Cops laughed at him, reporters mocked him, but no one, not even the feds, could prove he ran the Genovese family from the shadows. The act became legend. The Pajama Don. The man who walked the streets of Greenwich Village half mad, fully untouchable. But in his mind he was sharper than ever. And at night, when he returned to his apartment, the act would drop. The robe came off, the muttering stopped, and his voice turned cold as stone. "Who talked?" he'd ask. And men disappeared. The city around him evolved. Skyscrapers, neon, greed dressed in suits instead of leather jackets. But Vincent remained the same. Watching. Waiting. Operating in silence. He learned to move through the noise like smoke, invisible until it was too late. The FBI called him a phantom. The newspapers called him a relic. But those who truly knew whispered another name: the ghost of Mulberry Street. Late one night, walking home under a soft drizzle, Vincent stopped outside St. Patrick's old cathedral. The doors were closed, the street empty. He lit a cigarette, the flame briefly illuminating his face, lined, tired, unreadable. Somewhere far away a siren wailed. He looked up at the church's shadowed windows and whispered, "All this time they thought I was hiding from them. But I was just hiding from myself." He smiled faintly, almost sadly, and turned away. The rain fell harder. The street swallowed his footsteps. And once again New York forgot how close it had come to seeing the truth. New York, late 1980s. The city that never slept had grown louder, meaner, and slicker. The old cobblestones of Little Italy were fading under the weight of concrete and neon. New money, new drugs, new enemies, but the same hunger, the same rot beneath the glitter. And yet, in a quiet apartment on Sullivan Street, there lived a man who defied it all. To the neighbors he was harmless. Just a tired old Italian who shuffled through the streets in slippers and a bathrobe, mumbling prayers to himself, talking to the air. They called him the crazy man from the village. But the FBI had another name for him. Vincent, the Gigante, boss of the Genovese crime family. Every morning he followed the same ritual. He'd wake before dawn, light a candle before the small altar near his bed, and whisper the same prayer: "God, keep me invisible." Then he'd slip into his faded blue bathrobe, the one with the frayed collar, and step out into the rain-soaked streets. The city stirred slowly around him. Street vendors rolled up their shutters, taxi horns bled through the mist, and somewhere a church bell marked the hour. Vincent walked through it all like a ghost. He muttered to himself, incoherent, broken phrases that made strangers cross the street. But those who knew him knew better. The mumbling wasn't madness. It was disguise. Because behind those vacant eyes and slurred words lived a mind as sharp as ever. A man who had built his own invisibility like a fortress. The plan had started years before. The FBI had grown too close. The trials, the witnesses, the wiretaps, they were getting smarter, hungrier. Every conversation, every dinner, every handshake carried risk. Vincent understood something most mobsters didn't. You couldn't kill the government. But you could confuse it. So he created a ghost. A harmless, rambling lunatic who spent his days wandering Greenwich Village in pajamas, muttering nonsense. The crazy old man, who talked to pigeons and got lost on his way to the corner store. It worked better than he'd imagined. Neighbors pitied him. Priests prayed for him. Agents watching him through binoculars wrote in their reports, "Subject appears incoherent, disoriented, possibly delusional." It was performance art and Vincent was its genius. Inside though he was anything but mad. Each evening after his walk, he'd return home, close the blinds and the transformation would end. The bathrobe came off, replaced by tailored suits. The mumbling stopped. He'd sit at the dining table, the air heavy with cigar smoke, and listen while his most trusted men delivered updates. Profits, alliances, threats. No phones. No recordings. No witnesses. Vincent listened in silence, eyes half shut, as if he were still playing the part. But every number, every name, every word stuck in his memory. When he did speak, it was quiet. Always quiet. Tell Gotti, he'd say, to stay in his lane. Cut him off at the docks. Make it look like a bad shipment. And then, when business was done, he'd rise, put the bathrobe back on, and shuffle out again, the harmless fool returning to the street. For years the FBI tried to trap him. They tailed him. They bugged his cars, wired his buildings, questioned his family. But every time they thought they had him cornered, Vincent's act dissolved their case. He's not fit to stand trial, his lawyers argued. The man doesn't even know what year it is. Doctors confirmed it. Nurses testified. Psychiatrists wrote thick reports filled with words like delusional, paranoid, disoriented. And through it all, Vincent played the part flawlessly. At court appearances, he mumbled prayers and stared at the ceiling. Once he even fell asleep mid-hearing. The judge sighed. The agents cursed. And the case, another one, fell apart. But the truth was heavier than the performance. Some nights, when the apartment was dark and silent, Vincent sat alone by the window, staring at the city that no longer belonged to him. The streets below still pulsed with life. Dealers, hustlers, kids who thought they were gangsters. They used his name without understanding it. They talked about loyalty while carrying wires under their shirts. He'd whisper to himself, "They think I'm crazy. Maybe they're right." Because the line between the mask and the man had begun to blur. He had worn insanity so long it had started to wear him back. One winter night his daughter Rita came to visit. She found him sitting in his chair, bathrobe wrapped around him like a shroud, eyes distant. "Papa," she said softly, "they're watching again." "I know," he murmured. "You can stop this. You can tell them the truth." He turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "The truth," he said. "The truth is a luxury for men who can afford it." She looked away, tears in her eyes. "You're not living, Papa. You're hiding." He smiled faintly. "Hiding is living, sweetheart. Look at all the loud ones. Where are they now?" And she couldn't answer. That year John Gotti was arrested. The Teflon Don, the one who craved cameras, who loved the noise, who believed fame could protect him, gone. The newspapers called it the end of an era. Vincent read the headlines in silence. He folded the paper neatly, placed it beside his coffee and whispered, "The loud ones burn. The quiet ones fade." And then he went for his walk. But the walls were closing in. By the mid-1990s, technology had changed the game. Hidden mics, surveillance vans, informants with recorders in their pockets. It was a different war now, and Vincent was running out of space to hide. In 1997, after decades of playing both sides of sanity, the FBI finally caught a break. They bugged the apartment of one of his underbosses and heard the unthinkable, Vincent giving orders. The tapes were damning. Calm, deliberate, intelligent. The voice of a man fully aware of his empire. When the agents played the tapes in court, the illusion shattered. The pajama don was exposed. The trial became a spectacle. Reporters flooded the courthouse. The same old neighbors who once pitted him stared at the screen, seeing the truth for the first time. Vincent sat at the defense table, robe gone, wearing a gray suit. His hair was white now, his face carved with the lines of time and secrecy. As the prosecutor played the recordings, a faint smile touched his lips. Not guilt. Not fear. Just acceptance. They'd finally caught him. But they'd never truly understood him. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts, he nodded once, almost in respect. To the judge he said quietly, "You spent years chasing a ghost. Be careful what you do when you finally catch it." He was sent to federal prison. The cell was small, the light harsh, but he didn't mind. For the first time in decades he didn't have to pretend. The guards said he was polite, quiet, kept to himself. Some nights they swore they heard him praying in the dark. Others said he just sat there, eyes open, whispering to no one. Silence is the only thing that lasts. Years later, when he died, the newspapers recycled the same phrase. The last of the true bosses. The man who fooled the FBI. But those who'd known him knew better. He hadn't fooled anyone. He'd simply lived by the rule that had outlasted every empire from Chicago to New York. Power isn't what you show. It's what you hide. And as the candlelight in his cell flickered one last time, the world outside kept spinning, noisier, faster, emptier. On Mulberry Street, the pigeons still gathered where he used to walk, pecking at crumbs on the sidewalk. Someone said they'd seen an old man in a bathrobe there the night before, mumbling to himself. No one believed it. But no one walked that way after dark either. They called it the House of Shadows. From the outside it was nothing, a narrow brownstone on East Houston Street, squeezed between a bakery and an old tailor shop. The windows were always shut. The blinds never moved. To the neighbors, it was just another forgotten home in a city that forgot too much. But inside, behind those heavy curtains, power lived and breathed. Quietly. Methodically. Invisibly. This was where Vincent the Chin Gigante ruled his empire. Not from an office. Not from a nightclub. But from the darkness of his own living room. The air inside was thick with silence. A single lamp burned in the corner, casting pale gold across worn wallpaper. The faint ticking of a clock echoed through the hall. On a small table sat a rotary phone, disconnected. In the middle of the room, Vincent sat in his chair, robe draped over his shoulders, eyes half closed. Around him his captains waited, men twice his size but half his composure. They spoke only when spoken to, voices low, each word measured. "Salerno's boys are moving again," one whispered. "Trying to get the docks." Vincent didn't open his eyes. "Then move faster," he said softly. No threats. No shouting. Just that quiet tone, calm as a priest, final as a bullet. It was his way now. No meetings in restaurants, no business in cars, no notes, no phones. Orders were passed through layers of whispers. Brother to cousin, cousin to friend, friend to soldier. No one ever heard his voice directly, but everyone obeyed it. The FBI called it the most sophisticated command structure in organized crime. Vincent just called it survival. He'd learned from the ghosts of Chicago and the graves of every man who loved the spotlight. Big Jim, Capone, Gotti. Noise got you killed. Visibility was a death sentence. He'd turned invisibility into empire. At night, he would sometimes walk through the house in silence, each step careful, deliberate. The portraits on the wall stared back, his parents long gone, his younger self in boxing gloves, Vito Genovese, the mentor who taught him that loyalty had no expiration date. Sometimes he paused before the mirror in the hallway. The reflection that stared back wasn't the crazy old man the world saw. It was something colder, a man who'd learned to disappear without dying. He'd whisper to it almost like confession. "I built something no one can see. That means they'll never destroy it." Then he'd laugh softly, a sound closer to sorrow than joy. The agents watching him didn't laugh. They sat in vans outside, night after night, listening to static. No phone calls. No meetings. No mistakes. They'd watch him step out in his robe, muttering at the air, and wonder if the rumors were wrong, if maybe he really was crazy. But every time the FBI tried to squeeze his people, the city's underworld shifted in ways too precise to be coincidence. A rival arrested before a raid. A witness silenced a day before testimony. A shipment moved one block from where agents were waiting. There was no evidence. Only patterns. And in those patterns the Bureau saw something terrifying: control. In 1992, one agent, a rookie, asked his supervisor, "Sir, if he's really running everything, why does he live like a ghost?" The older man didn't look up from his notes. Because ghosts don't leave fingerprints. Vincent's genius wasn't domination, it was patience. He never reacted in anger. When a rival insulted him, he let it pass. When someone stole, he waited. Weeks later, months later, an accident. A car brake that failed. A man found in the river. No one ever connected it back. He had turned vengeance into ritual, measured not in hours but in seasons. But the walls of silence were not unbreakable. In the underworld, fear was never enough to hold everyone forever. Some of his men grew restless. They wanted recognition, the old glamour, the loud nights, the neon lights. "You're turning us into ghosts," one of them said once too boldly. "People used to know us. Fear us." Vincent looked at him, eyes heavy-lidded, voice low. "And where are they now, the ones people feared?" The man didn't answer. Vincent leaned forward. "Buried. Because they wanted to be remembered." He smiled faintly. "I'll take being forgotten." The next morning that soldier was gone. No one mentioned it again. Years blurred. The empire stayed quiet. The money flowed. Even his rivals stopped saying his name, not out of respect but out of superstition. They'd say "the old man," or "him upstairs," or simply gesture toward the east, where his house stood hidden among the brownstones. And through it all Vincent grew smaller, slower, more ghost than flesh. But his mind, that razor mind, never dulled. He once told a priest during confession, I've lied so long even God's forgotten what's true. The priest asked, do you regret it? Vincent smiled. Regret is for men who plan to stop. In winter, when the snow fell thick over Manhattan, the house looked almost peaceful, a single yellow light behind frosted glass. Inside, Vincent sat in his chair, wrapped in silence. Sometimes he'd dream of the ring, of gloves, sweat, the sound of the crowd. He'd wake up, heart pounding, hands shaking, unsure if he missed the fight or just the feeling of being seen. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built his power by erasing himself, and now the erasure was all he had left. He whispered into the dark. I made them forget me. And now I'm the only one who remembers who I was. The last time his lieutenants saw him alive, he was sitting in that same chair, eyes half closed, radio humming faint jazz. They asked for orders. He gave them none. He just raised a finger, motioned for quiet. Listen, he said. They listened. Outside, the city pulsed, cars, horns, voices, the hum of billions of lives rushing past. That's them, he whispered. The world. They think they're free. Then he smiled almost kindly. Let them. Shadows don't need sunlight. When he finally passed years later, it wasn't in prison or a courtroom. It was there, in that same chair, beneath that same light, surrounded by the hum of a city he'd ruled from silence. The papers called him a myth. The agents called him a monster. The men who once feared him said nothing at all. Because they knew, even in death, the chin would find a way to listen. And somewhere in the old brownstone, a clock still ticked, slow, steady, patient. The house stood empty, but if you walked by late enough, some swore you could still see a shadow sitting by the window. A bathrobe glowing faintly in the dark. Not moving. Not gone. Just waiting. For years he'd kept them guessing. The agents. The prosecutors. The city. They watched him shuffle down Sullivan Street in his robe and slippers, muttering to pigeons and street lamps, and they whispered to each other, is he crazy or is he laughing at us? By 1997, the whispering had turned to obsession. The Bureau wanted him more than anyone alive. Not because of what he'd done, but because of what they couldn't prove. Every file ended the same way, subject unfit for trial. Every investigation collapsed into the same silence he built around himself. Until one day the silence broke. It started small. A low-level associate wearing a wire. A conversation not meant to be recorded. The tape hissed to life and a voice, calm, deep, unmistakably lucid, gave an order. Not rambling. Not muttering. Clear. Commanding. The kind of voice that moves cities without raising its tone. The agents froze. Then they smiled. After 40 years of chasing shadows, they'd finally caught a sound. When they came for him, it was early morning. The air over Greenwich Village was cold and clean, the sky a shade of gray that didn't belong to any season. They knocked. He didn't answer. So they broke the door. The house of shadows, looked smaller than they'd imagined. Dust on the floor. A single chair. A radio still humming soft jazz. And there he was. The chin. 70 years old, bathrobe tied at the waist, slippers still on. He didn't flinch when they pointed the guns. He didn't ask why. He just smiled, a tired, knowing smile that said, you're late. The trial became legend before it even began. The press called it, the unmasking of the pajama don. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered. Reporters, onlookers, even old neighborhood faces from Little Italy. Inside, the marble halls echoed with the clicking of cameras. Vincent sat at the defense table, calm, eyes half shut. He wore no robe today. Just a gray suit that hung a little loose on his frame. The years had carved valleys in his face, but the eyes, those quiet, heavy eyes, still carried the same power. The prosecutor began. For decades, the defendant deceived this city, this nation, pretending to be insane while controlling one of the most powerful criminal organizations in America. He gestured toward the tapes. Listen for yourselves. They pressed play. And in the courtroom air, Vincent's own voice filled the silence. No meetings this week. Keep the trucks off the pier. I want that thing handled quietly. No slur. No nonsense. Just control. It was the sound of the mask cracking. The jurors stared. The reporters scribbled. The FBI agents who chased him half their lives finally allowed themselves to breathe. Vincent sat still, watching the reel of his own downfall play like an old song. When the tape ended, the room was silent, not out of respect but awe. The prosecutor smiled. The illusion is over, Mr. Gigante. Vincent leaned forward slightly, voice low. Son, he said, the illusion was never for you. It was for them. He nodded toward the jury. People need to believe monsters look different from the rest of them. Make sleep easier. The judge called for order. But no one spoke. Because for a moment, everyone in that courtroom, agents, lawyers, journalists, realized what he'd meant. He hadn't just fooled the law. He'd fooled America. The quietest man in the underworld had turned the system itself into his accomplice. When the verdict came, it was expected. Guilty. Conspiracy, racketeering, obstruction. As the bailiff read the sentence, 12 years federal custody, Vincent didn't react. He simply nodded once as if approving the decision. The guards led him away. The crowd outside cheered. But in the van, chained at the wrists, he just looked out the window at the skyline he'd once ruled and whispered, "All noise now. No music." In prison, they gave him a cell with a small window and a narrow bed. He didn't complain. He never did. The other inmates gave him space. Some didn't even realize who he was, just another old man shuffling the corridors in slippers. At night, when the lights dimmed, he'd sit on the edge of the bed and listen, to the pipes, the distant doors, the hum of electricity. It wasn't so different from home. Still the same house of shadows, just smaller. The guard said he was polite. Quiet. Sometimes he muttered prayers. Sometimes he laughed to himself, the sound low and distant, like a man remembering a joke only he understood. One guard once asked, "You ever miss the streets, old man?" Vincent smiled faintly. "The streets miss me." Years passed slowly. Age dulled the body but not the mind. He still remembered every name, every betrayal, every rule. And he still played the game, even here. When a young inmate tried to extort protection money from him, Vincent just looked up from his chessboard and said, "Son, if I die in this cell, someone will bury you in yours." The next morning the kid asked for a transfer. But beneath the quiet, the years began to eat at him. He stopped writing letters. Stopped meeting visitors. When his daughter came one last time, she found him thinner, slower, but still himself. "Papa," she whispered, "why did you do it all?" He looked at her for a long moment, then said softly, "To see how long a man can stay invisible before God notices." She started to cry. He reached for her hand. "Don't cry, Rita. I beat the world at its own game. That's more than most men can say." The day he died was ordinary. Gray sky. Quiet morning. The guards found him still sitting in bed, back straight, eyes open, as if waiting for someone who never came. In his lap was a folded piece of paper. On it, four words written in his careful hand. "Silence outlives everything." When news of his death reached New York, the city barely flinched. A few headlines. A few obituaries. Vincent Gigante, the pajama don, dies at 77. Master of deception, final act of silence. Then the world moved on, louder, faster, emptier. But in Little Italy on Mulberry Street, the old men sitting outside the cafe lifted their glasses. To the chin, one said. The last one who understood the rules. They drank quietly. No toasts. No laughter. Just the clink of glasses and the hum of the city beyond them. And somewhere in the village, in the house of shadows long since sold, a window creaked open in the wind. Inside, dust floated through the sunlight. The old chair still stood where it always had. And if you listened close enough, in the hush between the traffic and the church bells, you could swear you heard it. A faint whisper, calm, amused, echoing through the empty room. "Don't make noise. Just watch." Then silence again. The kind of silence that isn't empty, the kind that still remembers. The day Vincent the Chin Gigante died, the city didn't pause. New York doesn't stop for ghosts. But somewhere, beneath the hum of subways and sirens, something subtle shifted. The faint silence that always followed the fall of a king. In the Bronx, a man read the news in the back of a cafe. No expression. No words. Just a small nod, almost imperceptible. Liborio Barney, Bellomo. He was 50 then, gray already at the temples, eyes the color of asphalt after rain. His suit was plain, his watch cheap. To anyone passing by, he could have been an accountant, a bus driver, maybe a priest. But inside, behind that quiet stare, calculations moved like clockwork. Bellomo had grown up in the same world Gigante had ruled, same neighborhoods, same unspoken codes. He'd watched legends rise and burn, the flashy ones, the loud ones, the ones who mistook fear for loyalty. He'd learned early. The men who talked disappear first. By his 20s, he was already a name whispered in the Bronx. A man who never raised his voice, never showed his hand, but whose word traveled like gravity. He'd served under Gigante, not as a soldier but as a shadow, the kind of man you only noticed when you realized everyone else was already listening to him. When Gigante's empire began to crack, Bellomo didn't flinch. He waited. Patience, his only weapon, his only faith. After Gigante's death, the Genovese family gathered in fragments, scattered captains, uncertain alliances, too many questions and not enough answers. The FBI called it the vacuum. The streets called it the pause. And in that pause Barney moved. Not loudly. Not violently. Just inevitably. One by one the lieutenants came to him, not out of fear but fatigue. The old wars were over. The headlines had killed too many bosses. They didn't want another celebrity Don. They wanted quiet. Stability. Bellomo gave them both. He never declared himself boss. Never wore the crown. But everyone knew. Meetings became shorter. Decisions became cleaner. No one bragged, no one posed for photographs, no one took unnecessary risks. If Gigante had been the ghost that haunted the city, Bellomo became its echo, quieter, colder, more invisible. The FBI had spent decades chasing the Genovese family through wiretaps and indictments. Now they found themselves chasing nothing. Their reports were filled with question marks. No names. No leads. Just whispers, Barney's back. He'd done time before, long stretches, years behind concrete walls, and came out untouched, unchanged. The agents said prison couldn't break him because there was nothing to break. He didn't boast. He didn't confess. He didn't even talk. One of the guards once said, that man could teach silence to a church. Bellomo's power was quiet precision. He didn't run his organization, he tuned it. Like a musician tuning an old violin, adjusting one string at a time until the sound was pure. He cut unnecessary noise, flashy extortionists, reckless dealers, anyone who thought headlines were worth the risk. He shifted the family from the streets to the shadows, construction unions, waste management, legitimate businesses. Invisible money. Untraceable influence. The city changed but the rules stayed the same. Respect the silence. Fear the calm. One winter night, sitting in the back of a parked sedan under the bridge, a younger man asked him, "Boss, how'd you get this far without getting caught?" Barney looked out the windshield at the city lights glittering on the water. "Simple," he said. "Everyone wants to be remembered. I don't." The young man nodded, not understanding. Bellomo turned to him, voice almost a whisper. "You remember the old man Gigante?" "Yeah. They said he went crazy." Barney smiled slightly. "He wasn't crazy. He was free." Under Bellomo's rule, the Genovese family became something different. Less like a gang, more like a shadow government. Decisions passed through layers of silence. Meetings happened in churches, funerals, weddings, never offices. A handshake, a glance, a nod, enough to shift millions. And through it all, Barney remained invisible. No phone calls. No photographs. Most of the new soldiers had never even seen him. Yet every order they received began the same way. "This comes from Barney." It didn't need to be proven. The name was proof enough. The FBI called him the Phantom Boss. But those who truly knew him called him something else, the Gentleman of Silence. He spoke softly, listened longer, and made men disappear without ever raising his tone. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't kind. He was efficient. And efficiency in the underworld is scarier than cruelty. But even ghosts grow tired. By the 2010s, Bellomo had seen enough. Too many betrayals, too many cameras, too much noise. He started delegating, slowly fading from sight, just as Gigante had done before him. The new generation of mobsters didn't understand restraint. They wanted what the world promised: attention. They live-streamed their cars, posted photos, bragged online about being made. Barney watched from the shadows, shaking his head. He told one of his old lieutenants, "They've traded power for followers. We built silence, they're selling echoes." The old lieutenant asked, "So what do we do?" Barney smiled faintly. "We wait. The loud ones always disappear first." When he was arrested again in 2016, the headlines screamed, "Genovese boss returns to court after 2 decades." They showed old photos, grainy, years out of date. Inside the courthouse, the reporters leaned forward, waiting for the outburst, the arrogance, the flash. But when he entered, he was calm. Clean suit. No words. He looked at the cameras like they were children waving toys, then turned to the judge and said only one sentence. "I have nothing to say." It wasn't defiance. It was doctrine. He served his time quietly, then faded again. No one quite sure when he left prison where he went, or whether he still commanded anything at all. Some said he retired to the mountains. Some said he still walked the Bronx in plain clothes, invisible among the people he once ruled. And some, the old-timers, swore they saw him one night outside a church, lighting a candle beneath a statue of St. Anthony, whispering a prayer no one else could hear. Today, when agents speak of the Genovese family, they still lower their voices. The others, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, make noise, fight, collapse. But the Genovese remain. Untouched. Unseen. Because silence, once perfected, never dies. Somewhere in New York, an old cafe still stands. The same one where Bellomo used to sit, reading the paper in the corner. A chair still pushed back, a cup still half full. No name. No plaque. No memory. But if you walk by just before closing, you might hear it. The faint scrape of a chair, the soft rustle of a newspaper, the echo of a voice barely above a whisper. Don't chase power. Let it come to you. Then nothing. Only the hum of the city swallowing the sound as it always does. Power doesn't disappear. It adapts. It changes names, faces, cities, but never the rhythm. When the newspapers declared the mafia dead, when the agents raised their glasses and the politicians claimed victory, the truth was quieter than ever. The empire had not died. It had gone invisible. In the old days you could see power. It sat in restaurants, wore diamonds, drove Cadillacs. It shook hands with mayors and smiled for cameras. But that kind of power was fragile, too loud to last. Liborio Barney Bellomo understood something his predecessors never could. Visibility is vulnerability. And so he built a kingdom no one could touch, because no one could even find it. It wasn't in the casinos or the docks anymore. It wasn't in the bars or the backrooms. It was in the contracts, the unions, the quiet favors traded between men in suits who'd never fired a gun. The streets had changed, but the current beneath them still ran the same color, the soft gray of corruption too old to kill. Bellomo didn't rule with fear. He ruled with absence. There were no public meetings. No names in ledgers. Only invisible lines connecting men who owed each other silence. And somewhere, in the deep network of those lines, every thread still led back to him. In the Bronx there was a building with no sign. An accounting office by day, a storage room by night. No guards, no cameras, no flags. Every week, envelopes arrived, plain, sealed, unmarked. No one opened them. No one had to. Money flowed in one direction. Loyalty in the other. If someone asked, "Who's in charge?" the answer was always the same. No one you'll ever meet. Agents kept watching. They mapped patterns, traced bank accounts, followed whispers. But all they ever caught were shadows of shadows. Empty shells, decoys, ghosts. It was as if the Genovese family had evolved beyond flesh and blood. A machine of trust, ritual, and memory, functioning perfectly without anyone at its center. They called it the Invisible Empire. And to the few who truly understood, it was beautiful. Terrible, yes, but beautiful. Power used to be a man with a gun. Now it was a man with a phone who never had to speak. Orders weren't given anymore. They were implied. A nod across a courtroom. A handshake at a funeral. A donation made at the right time. No words. No witnesses. Just cause and effect. One retired detective once said, "The Genovese aren't a family anymore. They're a weather system. You don't fight them. You adjust to them." He wasn't wrong. They moved with the seasons, contracts, elections, construction booms. When one city dried up, another bloomed. Their hands were everywhere and nowhere. Bellomo himself had vanished from sight. He no longer appeared in the Bronx. No more cafes, no more cars waiting outside. Some said he was living quietly upstate near a lake. Others swore he was still in New York, the old man feeding pigeons in the park, unseen, unbothered. A myth walking among mortals. But even myths cast shadows. One night, a young associate, too eager, too curious, asked his uncle, "Uncle Joe, does Barney still run things?" The old man stirred his espresso, watching the dark swirl. "Kid," he said, "Barney doesn't run anything. He is the thing." Time moved forward. The internet replaced the streets. The mobs of the new age wore hoodies instead of suits, coded instead of extorted. But the Genovese way remained, patient, quiet, unrecorded. They didn't need the noise. They were the noise, the low hum beneath every legitimate business, every handshake deal, every unspoken understanding that some debts are never written down. It wasn't about crime anymore. It was about continuity. In Washington, a young analyst once tried to explain it in a report. The Genovese organization functions less like organized crime and more like a distributed algorithm. Self-correcting, self-preserving, and almost entirely self-erasing. Her supervisor laughed. "You're saying it's software?" She looked him in the eye. "I'm saying it's evolution." By the 2020s, the name Genovese had faded from the papers. But the people, the brokers, the foremen, the contractors, still operated as if someone, somewhere, was watching. They followed the old codes. Don't brag, don't talk, don't leave traces. The culture of silence had outlived its founders. And in that silence, the empire kept breathing. Sometimes, late at night, a detective still working cold cases would drive through Little Italy, windows down, hoping to catch a hint of the old world. The smell of cigar smoke, the faint sound of jazz from a bar long closed. Once he swore he heard it. A man's voice, calm, low, coming from nowhere and everywhere. Nothing ever ends, kid. It just goes quiet. He stopped the car, heart pounding. But the street was empty. In a way, that was how it was meant to be. The visible world belonged to politicians and corporations, to billionaires and scandals. The invisible world, the one that actually decided what survived, belonged to men like Bellomo. He'd turned invisibility into immortality. Because you can kill a man but not a whisper. You can burn a house but not the shadow it casts. And so, somewhere in the vast hum of New York, in a building without a name, down a hallway no one notices, a light still burns. A file cabinet. A stack of envelopes. A chair facing the window. No photos. No portraits. Only a reflection in the glass, faint, aging, untraceable. If you stand there long enough you might see it too. A shape that looks almost human. A face you can't quite describe. And if you listen, really listen, you'll hear the same words whispered once in Chicago, once in New York, once in every room where power hides. Silence outlives everything. Then the wind shifts. The light flickers. And the empire, unseen, eternal, exhales. The morning he was taken, the sky over the Bronx was the color of cold steel. No sirens. No drama. Just the soft knock of men who'd waited years to be sure. Inside a narrow apartment above a quiet street, Liborio, Barney, Bellomo opened his eyes before the first knock came. He'd felt them coming, the way old wolves can sense the hunt before the wind changes. He stood, adjusted the cuffs of his white shirt and looked out the window. The city was waking, buses groaning, a kid shouting to his mother from the sidewalk, a dog barking in rhythm with the world's indifference. He smiled faintly. Right on time. The knock came again. Louder now. Federal agents. Open the door. Bellomo didn't move right away. He poured coffee, slow and calm. The smell filled the small kitchen, warm and bitter. Then he opened the door. The men outside looked nothing like the agents of old. No hats, no trench coats. Just clean suits, earpieces, the kind of faces that believed technology had replaced instinct. Mr. Bellomo, one said, you know why we're here. He nodded. Of course. Will you come quietly? He sipped the coffee, set it down. I always do. They expected fear. They got silence. No protests, no questions. He even locked the door behind him as they led him down the hall. A neighbor peeked out, an old woman in a nightgown. He's a nice man, she said to the agents. Always polite. The agent nodded, uneasy. Yes, ma'am. That's what they all say. At headquarters, the young prosecutor paced in front of the cameras, all bright ambition and caffeine. We have Liborio Bellomo, he announced. Head of the Genovese family. The last real Don. The reporters scribbled like priests recording scripture. It sounded definitive, heroic. The final capture, the closing chapter. But Bellomo, sitting alone in the next room, smiled. Because he knew what they didn't. You can arrest a man. You can't arrest an idea. The interrogation began. Two agents, both confident, both eager. They asked about the family, about money, about names. He didn't answer. Not silence out of defiance, silence out of principle. He simply looked at them, steady and unhurried, as if watching children rehearse a play. Finally, one agent slammed his hand on the table. You think this code of silence still means anything? This isn't 1950, old man. Barney leaned forward, voice low, calm. Kid, the code is the only thing that ever meant anything. At the arraignment, the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled every row, cameras flashing like lightning. He wore a plain gray suit, no jewelry, no flash. He didn't look like power. He looked like absence given form. The prosecutor listed the charges. Racketeering, conspiracy, extortion. Bellomo just watched him, expression unreadable. When the judge asked for a plea, he said softly, not guilty. Do you understand the charges against you? I understand everything, he said. Even what isn't written down. They sent him to Metropolitan Correctional. A cell barely wide enough for a bed and a sink. He didn't mind. The guards found him polite, quiet, predictable, the same old man the neighbors described. He read books. Mostly history. Sometimes poetry. When asked why, he said, Because it's nice to read about men who made noise before vanishing. Weeks became months. Trials, hearings, postponements, all blurring into gray sameness. The press lost interest. The prosecutors moved on to newer villains with brighter headlines. But something strange happened inside the bureau. Whenever Bellomo was questioned, cases started to fall apart. Witnesses recanted, files went missing, men who'd been ready to talk suddenly forgot what they knew. It wasn't intimidation. It was gravity. Even caged, he pulled the city towards silence. Then one spring morning it ended. He was released. No cameras this time. No reporters. Just the click of a cell door and the echo of footsteps down the corridor. The guard asked, "Where will you go now?" Barney smiled faintly. "Home. Back to the Bronx?" "No," he said, looking toward the faint light at the end of the hall. "Somewhere quieter." No one saw him for a long time after that. Rumors said he'd retired to upstate New York, a small town by the water. Others claimed he was living under another name, tending a church garden, feeding stray cats. But those who truly knew said nothing. Because that's how he wanted it. One evening, years later, a detective found himself driving past the Hudson River at dusk. The water was gold, the air still. And there, on a bench facing the water, sat an old man. Alone. The detective slowed the car. The man looked up, nodded once, and went back to staring at the horizon. The detective drove on, heart racing for reasons he couldn't explain. Later, when someone asked what he'd seen, he said, "I don't know." But for a second, the river looked like it was listening. In the years that followed, the underworld changed again. The old family splintered, merged, hid inside corporations and charities. But the Genovese family remained steady, faceless, seamless, silent. Agents called it institutional memory. Old-timers called it Barney's ghost. Because even when he was gone, his way of being, the quiet, the patience, the invisibility, lingered like perfume on a forgotten coat. Some say he returned to the city once. Just once. It was a cold night in Little Italy. A priest closing up the church saw a man light a candle and kneel in the back pew. He prayed for a long time, whispering in Italian. Then he stood, left a folded note under the candle, and walked out into the fog. When the priest picked it up, he found 4 words written in neat script. "Silence keeps us alive." No one saw him again. But sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind slides down the alleys and the lights flicker on Mulberry Street, the shopkeepers swear they feel it. A presence, watching, unseen. They lock their doors a little earlier. They lower their voices when they talk about money. Old habits. Old ghosts. And somewhere in the city's endless hum, between the laughter, the sirens, the rain, if you listen carefully, you might catch the faintest sound. Not a gunshot. Not a scream. Just a man's voice, calm and low, drifting through the noise. You can't arrest silence. Then the city swallows it again. Like it always does. Chicago. New York. 2 cities divided by miles but joined by the same heartbeat. The quiet pulse of men who believed they could build eternity from shadows. Once there had been music. Laughter in the cafes, champagne spilling on marble floors, diamond pins catching the light. Big Jim Colosimo had ruled with charm and excess, a man who mistook applause for immortality. He'd died smiling, still believing the party would never end. Decades later, Vincent, the chin Gigante, had learned from that mistake. He'd traded applause for whispers, attention for madness, and built an empire out of silence. He'd survived long enough to watch the world forget what power even looked like. And then came Bellomo, the last student of that ancient art. A man who turned disappearance into a discipline, who proved that invisibility could outlast every bullet, every indictment, every scream. Now their names were history, spoken only in low tones by old men and by the city itself, which still remembered even when its people didn't. The streets remember. They always do. In Chicago, the old Colosimo Cafe has been replaced by a chain restaurant. Families eat under the same chandeliers that once reflected murder. No one there knows whose blood once stained the floor. But sometimes when the lights flicker, the waiters swear they smell cigar smoke, faint, sweet, ancient. In New York, the brownstone where Gigante ruled from silence has been renovated. A young couple lives there now. They say the walls creak at night, and that the radio sometimes turns itself on, playing jazz no one can trace. And in the Bronx, there's a church that keeps one candle burning all night. The priest doesn't know who pays for it. The envelope just arrives, every month on time. 3 cities. 3 ghosts. One empire that never really died. Because silence, once born, never stops growing. It moves like wind under doors, through wires, across oceans. It seeps into boardrooms, courtrooms, and bedrooms, wherever power needs a place to hide. The Genovese family didn't end with prison sentences or funerals. It simply evolved. It became something harder to name, a rhythm, a culture, a code. They taught that power isn't what you take. It's what you refuse to show. The FBI still keeps the files, yellowed and brittle boxes stacked in federal basements. Photographs, transcripts, wiretap logs, the echo of a war fought in shadows. Every so often, a young agent reads the old reports, shakes his head and says, "They don't make them like that anymore." He's wrong. They still do. You just can't see them. There's a kind of poetry in that, the way history forgets its authors while repeating their lessons. Every politician who smiles too long, every businessman who wins without being noticed, every empire that rises without firing a shot, somewhere in its DNA lives the ghost of that old code. No fingerprints. No names. Only cause and effect, as quiet and unstoppable as gravity. Imagine the camera drifting now, over the skyline of New York, down through the avenues, past the bridges, into the old neighborhoods where it all began. The narrator's voice slows. They thought the story ended with arrests, with deaths, with tombstones and headlines. But the story never ends. It just lowers its voice. In the backroom of a tiny cafe on Mulberry Street, an old record player still works. The needle scratches across vinyl, playing a soft, slow jazz tune. The owner doesn't remember where the record came from. But on the label, faded and cracked, one word is still legible: Silenzio. Outside, the night rain begins to fall. It glazes the streets in gold and shadow, exactly the way it did when Big Jim toasted his last glass of wine, when Gigante muttered his last prayer, when Bellomo vanished into the air. 3 generations. One rule. Never speak more than you must. Never be seen more than you need. Never leave a sound behind you that you wouldn't want the world to hear again. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear them still, the laughter from Chicago, the whispers from Little Italy, the breath of an empire that refused to die. Because in the end, the American underworld was never about money or murder. It was about belief. The belief that silence could be sacred, that if you mastered it, it could set you free. Now the world hums with endless noise. Screens, feeds, voices, lies. Everyone shouting to be seen. Everyone chasing the echo of their own name. And somewhere, far from the lights, the last remnants of the old world watch and smile. They know what the rest have forgotten. Noise fades. Silence lasts. The candle in the church still burns. The jazz still hums. And the cities still whisper their secret prayer, older than law, older than sin. Silence outlives everything. Then the lights go out. And the story sleeps.